If you know what the question is, AI will give you the answer pretty well, or will be incredibly helpful, probably better than anybody else, in finding the answer to it. The challenge that we've all got now is to think of questions that haven't been asked before.
Welcome to the Meaningful Work, Meaningful Life podcast, the show that empowers you to redefine the life you want and live your best life now. I'm your host, Francine Beleyi, and in season 11, On Purpose, How to Live, Lead, and Thrive in the AI Age, we are exploring how to align personal purpose, leadership, and innovation without losing your human heartbeats. There is a moment in life when the world stops defining you by your title, and you might decide what will define you next. For many people, that moment is terrifying. For today's guest, it became the beginning of the most curious, creative, and liberating chapter of his life. Dr. Bruce Lloyd is an Emeritus Professor of Strategic Management, a futurist, and a thinker on wisdom and societal change. He's been retired for over 20 years, and yet he's more alive, more curious, and more intellectually engaged than many people still chasing titles and validation. In this conversation, Bruce holds up a mirror to a civilization that is moving faster, but not necessarily becoming wiser. Hi, Bruce. Welcome to the Meaningful Work, Meaningful Life.
Thank you for having me again.
I'm so delighted to have you again. Years of retirement. Oh, actually, how long have you been in retirement?
I think formally I have been retired. About 20 years, yes.
Yeah, yet you stay curious, sharp, and restless. And we have many conversations offline. So tell me, what kept you from fading into irrelevance and kept you curious all those years after you retired?
Well, I suppose the simple answer is that it's just a continuation of my previous life. One of the things that I don't think is discussed enough when we talk about the future of work is, what do we mean by work? What do we mean by retirement? I think that we need to rethink both those critical concepts together.
Yeah. Tell us more then. What do we mean by work and what do we mean by retirement?
Well, why do people work? I think that a lot of people have to work because they put at the top of their priorities the need for financial security. I think a lot of other people work because they don't give it such a high priority, but they are much more interested in the creative industries or creative activities. Even that group have to have a certain amount of financial security, but if you're lucky or you plan your life well, you can manage to get a satisfactory level of financial security without sacrificing too much on the creative side. Because I think there's a very big problem in the world today with people subjecting themselves to an obsession with material rewards, and that creates what I call a form of economic slavery, that they give up their freedom in a lot of areas because they focus on the fact that their only purpose is to make money, or not necessarily the only, but the main one. Now, if you move into retirement and you have financial security, which, of course, if you don't have financial security in retirement, you have a very limited number of options to sort it out anyway. But if you've been involved in a lot of what I would call creative activities, the most extreme of which I would say is writing novels, you never ask a novelist at 65, are you going to retire? They retire probably in their 80s or 90s when they say, I don't think I've got another book in me. So I think we've got to spend more time thinking about how people manage their creative activities, which actually can be a very effective way of defining a purpose.
Yeah, we're going to talk a lot more about that in a moment. But tell me, you have that ability or the luck to be financial secure in your retirement, which many people at the moment are thinking that that is not going to be the case. So if you are not financially secure in your retirement, what are your options?
Let me just say a couple of comments about financial security anyway, in general. I've had a bit of luck, but I've also made some choices. I haven't moved house for 50 years. I've got a car that's quite satisfactory, that's 20 years old. It only does 20,000 miles, done 20,000 miles in those 20 years. So I have given up the idea that I want massive house with many more rooms than I need. I've given up wanting a Mercedes as a way of defining what my motoring needs are. In fact, it's around here, I think more and more people are giving up cars altogether. And I'm not opting for riding on electric scooters. I happen to have a partner and a wife who's very sympathetic to these agendas. She's not wanting big houses or lots of jewelry. And of course, the other thing is, for all sorts of reasons, we don't have children. Now, if you take all those things away, it frees up an awful lot of financial pressures. Now, getting on to your main question, what do you do if you've retired and you still haven't got financial security?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, you have to look very carefully at what your income, expenditure, and priorities actually are to start with. If you are wanting to generate additional income, there are some ways that you can do it on a freelance basis. Depending on what your skills and interests are, you could write another novel or a book if that's what you do, although I think most of those don't make very much money for the authors. But that's often more to do with marketing than the product. I won't, if you're really desperate, you could go around to Tesco's and Waitrose and see what sort of job opportunities they have for people. And some people do that not for extra financial security, but because of the social dimension. So there is that issue, which I think we might come back to, because I think the internet and AI activities can also be a vehicle for generating social connections in a way that didn't exist before.
Yeah, definitely. We're going to talk about that also in a moment. So, when we're staying again on this topic of fear of retirement, most of the people actually fear of losing purpose when they go in retirement. So what have you discovered much more about purpose, and when all those job titles, we are no longer the Dr. Bruce Lloyd, the strategic futurist that get all the invitations to those fancy dinners and stuff like that. So what have you discovered?
Well, up to a point, I could have as many of those still as I want to have, but I've chosen to opt out of them, partly for health reasons, but partly for other reasons as well. Now, but going back to your fundamental question, I think there is a major issue for an awful lot of people, generally speaking, historically male, who have what I would call institutional jobs and are finding themselves in a new world when they've become deinstitutionalized. And quite often they haven't got very much control over not that they necessarily had a lot of control over their lives when they were institutionalized, but at least they had income generation to compensate for that and some socialization activities. But if they find themselves, let me coin a phrase, stuck at home and just moping about at home, you've got a problem. You've got a problem. They've got a problem. Their family's got a problem. And some of them generate new interests of following sport more actively, following a hobby that they had during the rest of their lives, which they never took seriously. But in many ways, you've got to have something that gives you some priorities. Some people manage to have that sense of purpose anyway through religion that can give people a very easy movement from one area to another. I've found I've had a hobby going on for more than 50 years of taking photographs. And that's something you can do much more easily now. It's quite incredible what you can do on the iPhone. Just as an aside to that, but really by accident, and most of the things in my career have happened more by accident than design. But by accident, 2 or 3 years ago, I happened to see a rainbow cut across the road round where I live. And I thought, well, that's interesting, taken on the iPhone. And I sent it off to the local paper. It has a couple of pages, which is basically readers' contributions. You don't get paid for this. Since that, they accepted that one. And since that, in the last couple of years, they've used about 120 of local pictures of color, flowers, nature. It's quite it's an added interest, but I've still got it involved in writing, uploading things on LinkedIn. You don't have to go through any of these rigorous exercises for conference submissions, although some of them are less rigorous than others, or develop obscure academic journals to get research assessment exercise. You just are able to write and publish on the internet, one way or another, what you feel strongly about.
Yeah.
And I've got plenty of things I feel strongly about.
Yeah, so because you are nature, you are a curious person, right? So, and I suppose that as a curious person, a lot of people, some of the people are not that curious. But tell me, what drives that curiosity? And still today, do you think that when you are curious, you are born curious and you die curious, or how does that? Are you more curious now than before?
I have more freedom to be curious across a wider range of questions than I was curious before, partly thanks to AI.
You're going to talk a lot about AI in a moment and your experiment.
But where did it all come from? I'm not sure. In fact, I was originally born during the German occupation of the Channel Islands, and I think I picked up from that a lack of enthusiasm for being institutionalized. I don't know whether it was the pressures that existed around at the time that developed. My mother used to say, "Why are you always asking why?" Well, I often think now, in reflection, children ask why, partly because they want to know the answers, but partly because they're playing a power game with the people who are supposed to be supplying them with the answers, because they half know that they don't know the answer. And that makes them even more curious, because it's a way of developing power in a domestic situation early on in life.
Oh, we're going to talk about this power as well in a moment.
Reflection on that early life, and I've no idea how true it is, but all I can say is that today and in the last few years, I've had the opportunity to explore my curiosity without being constrained by other people. I'm more in control of it. Before COVID, I was lucky enough to do a bit of traveling on some expedition type activities to various parts of the world, which also fitted in with the photography interests as well. But since COVID, I haven't done any of that, and have found that dimension of my curiosity has to be focused on other areas which I can relate to more actively at home.
Yeah. Thank you. So, and I've seen some of those beautiful photographs of your expedition of the big cat and all those wild animals. So, but if we come back to power, that you say I know that you are kind of, you talk a lot about power and responsibility. That's something that always comes in our conversations. And so what exactly now is responsible? Who actually, I'll say, is responsible today when power is shifting to algorithm?
Well, that's a big...
Sure that you have a long answer for that one.
That's a big question. One of the things that has happened and could well change because of AI is that historically people who have had the loudest voice tend to seem to get the most power. But today, I was brought up with science and engineering, and I have a natural tendency to be interested in trying to find rational solutions to problems. Sometimes emotions can be very helpful as an energy element in driving a passion to solve a problem. But quite often, emotional issues and organizational games, personal games as well in organizations, get in the way of solving a problem. And personally, I think if you can define the question that you're trying to solve, and there are people historically quite rightly have said, if you want to find a solution to a problem, you want to spend 90% of the time defining the problem. And in this context, it's really about defining the right question and questions that you want to start by asking AI. And AI it's incredibly well informed, far better informed than almost anybody, probably anybody. It has an incredible capacity for structuring that information in a useful way. It doesn't like padding. It focuses on answering the question. There are plenty of opportunities to follow up on what it comes up with. And I do think it can be incredibly helpful in helping humans come up with better answers to the world's problems. You might be interested in an exercise that I've had a bit of internet communication about, but hasn't got very far, so far. But 6 months ago, I asked AI to generate a solution to the Ukraine conflict that was satisfactory that would be satisfactory to all the stakeholders. Now, I recognize that this was challenging. It took on the challenge. It came up with roadmaps and guidance and a reasonable package of answers. Recently, I've just asked it to compare its set of answers to Trump's 28 points and identify the differences. Well, personally, I think that using that methodology could be a way of taking the personal game playing out of it and help us move to a much more satisfactory set of answers more quickly than appears to be the case at the moment. We'll see.
Yeah, but as you know, in all games, and since the society is the way it is, this is because of personal emotion and personal games, right? Do you think there will be a point where we're going to take those emotions out and then allow a fair world without games to play out?
Okay. First of all, I wouldn't quite use such an extreme. Fairer world, I don't think you can eliminate games. And of course, AI has limitations. It has its own biases. It sometimes gets things wrong, so it does need to be checked. But I think it can be very helpful. The biggest problem or challenge that it faces, or we face in trying to get it applied, is the vested interests that other people have in old methodologies. And that means if you want to get it done, you want to try to get it explored with, in a sense, outside organizations that don't have the same vested interests in the traditional way that things have been done. That's, of course, the same thing that happens inside trying to apply it in organizations. It's much more challenging to see new methodologies and radically new innovations applied to existing companies. But if you can find new companies, and there are new companies, that both their product and their processes are being AI driven, they are going to find it a lot easier to get the benefits of AI than some of these traditional companies that will get bogged down in the bureaucracy of managing change effectively, especially when most of them have incredibly low trust levels in the organization. So they're not very good at managing change in the first place.
Yeah. And also because they are still trying to fit AI into the old paradigm instead of coming up with a completely new paradigm that a new company may actually do. Tell me about those AI experiments that you are doing now. So you are experimenting with all kind of model, with ChatGPT, Copilot, Gemini, Claude, DeepSeek, etc. Tell me what actually surprised you the most and what disappoints you as well.
One of the experiments that surprised me, it was an interesting exercise. I've always thought it would have made a good PhD for somebody, explored about a year ago, when the PhD would have been for somebody to go into their bathroom and list out 100 products in the bathroom, from the taps to the tiles to the curtains to the toothpaste to the toothbrush. I think without difficulty, most people would find that they could easily list out 100 products. I then wanted to know where all the raw materials came from for those products, where they were processed, and how did they get to my bathroom. Now, that is something we all take for granted. I thought that I don't think AI could manage that. I didn't get them to do the final bit about delivery. I was interested in the raw materials and where they were manufactured. They all did a pretty good job. I must say, probably somebody else would have to go through it all to check it, because they were all coming up with very specific breakdowns of raw materials and where things were processed. But the net result, which is what I was trying to confirm in the first place, is that for the UK at least, almost none of the raw materials come from the UK. Almost none of the products are manufactured in the UK, and yet we end up with a bathroom which we all take for granted that is essentially a reflection of a massive interdependent globalization. Now, it also shows that we have to be much more concerned, perhaps, with unpredictable interference with supply chains now. I didn't get into that, but it was an exercise which surprised me that I didn't think AI could do it. Another exercise I did was that I asked different AIs what Shakespearean play is the most relevant today and the future, and why. There was, I would say, 60 or 70% general agreement, but I was also surprised by the fact that they didn't all agree. Their analysis was all impressive, though I'm not a Shakespearean expert. I felt that all their comments were insightful and relevant, but they didn't all agree. So it's interesting to see if you apply AI to certain, what I would call intellectual, cultural analysis, you don't come up with the same answer. So in a way, every answer that they came up with was well argued and could be taken as a definitive answer if you just looked at one of them.
Yeah. And I suppose that it is reassuring that they will not come up with the same answer, right? Otherwise, it will be like if the world is becoming now white or black, right? So it's reassuring that they are actually, is their reasoning or, supposedly reasoning, you can argue one way or the other, taking some other thing in consideration. So therefore, they are a bit more human-like then. Because if you take 10 PhD together, I'm sure that they also will come up with different, or the Shakespearean experts, they also may come up with a complete different answers why they pick this one versus the other.
Yeah. Now, another exercise I did recently, because somebody on the internet, I won't identify who and where, considered AI utter nonsense and was very emotionally anti-AI. And it was coming from a particular gender perspective. So I asked AI whether it felt there were any gender biases in its processes. All of them said yes. All of them identified where they were, and all of them came up with areas that need to be addressed to improve it. And that is a dimension that, again, you can use AI for. It doesn't just help you analyze the problem, it helps you identify potential areas for better solutions. Not perfect solutions, but better ones.
Yeah. One of the things also that I like to explore is that now we are have abundant information, right? And information is infinite. What now becomes scarce and what becomes valuable in this AI age?
That is a nightmare. It's a nightmare for a lot of people. Particularly, I would say, I find it a bit of a nightmare because I've had a career and a life that has not benefited from what I would call an obsessive focus. It's benefited from almost obsessive flexibility. And I've been far too interested in too many things. Many people could quite rightly argue superficially, but in a way ending up with looking at strategy and future studies. I've been interested in making connections. The trouble is now there are so many things that you can make connections about.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing about AI is it works on the helping you to generate a focus. Well, I think it can cope with open-ended questions, but we all have now got so much choice. I was just thinking the other day, probably you can't remember, but when I was brought up, you were lucky to get BBC One, and then you had ITV. Now it is quite staggering how many films you can record them, playback, Netflix, Apple, Amazon,
all kind of other abroad
all over the world,
Yep.
sports channels from coming out of your ears. And somehow you've got to decide what you want to choose to watch. I think I'm a bit surprised that this daytime calendar that we have of TV still exists, because I think most of the people, especially young people, either use the internet or they record what it is they want to watch, and they watch it when they want to watch it.
You don't even need to record it. It has been recorded already. You just watch on the replay.
Sometimes the great advantage, don't tell anybody about this,
Okay.
but the great advantage of recording it is you can fast forward through the adverts.
Yeah.
But
so again, if you buy, you take the premium option, you can also watch without the adverts.
Yes, if you pay the premium.
Yes.
Now, most of the people who watch daytime television don't watch it. It's just background noise anyway. They feel comforted by having that on in the background. Well, how sustainable is that?
What do you think is scarce now? So we agree that we have too much of stuff. What is scarce? What is going to be quite valuable?
Well, I asked AI this question.
AI said,
I phrased it in the way that I said, if you know what the question is, AI will give you the answer pretty well, or will be incredibly helpful, probably better than anybody else, in finding the answer to it. The challenge that we've all got now is to think of questions that haven't been asked before, or, of course, to get into activities that AI doesn't directly affect. So, funnily enough, not surprising, there seem to be more and more people going to opera, more and more people going to watch football, more and more people wanting to participate directly or indirectly, a whole range of activities. But again, looking back, again, was something I was exploring. I haven't really completed this exploration. Again, when I was a student, they took us around a car factory, I think down in Dagenham, one of Ford's factories, absolutely full of people making cars. Now, if you go around a car factory, there's nobody on the factory floor. It's all using robots. So what we've done is automated mechanical work, a lot of mechanical work, not the cleaning machines here, although all of them use much more sophisticated equipment than they were using 10 or 20 years ago. But what we're finding now is that AI is going to essentially automate into a lot of knowledge work that wasn't real intellectual work. Now, it says, when I did this exercise with it, and it's an exercise that also anybody can do, because that's another very interesting issue. There was a graph recently I saw that showed the take-up of the internet globally. And it's taken about 10 years to get the internet up to 90% of the world's population having access to the internet. It's taken about 2 years for that to happen for AI. Now, why was that the case? In my view, there's a very simple answer. The internet needed hardware. It needed broadband. We couldn't have this conversation 10 years ago because the broadband capacity didn't exist. But now that we've got the hardware, the software can go global in 5 minutes. This is a new ball game too. And you've got to try to understand how the relationship between the hardware and the software work out. And of course, we haven't begun to talk about the cultural change issues which are taking place in society and where they're going to end up in the future, because they're the most interesting and the most difficult, because we really don't know the answers to those questions, and AI doesn't either, because we haven't researched them.
Yes. And also, let us bring us back also, again, in this theme of what is scarce, to organization and how we work. You've always said that the quality of conversations actually determine the quality of decision, right? So now in this AI age, how do we bring that back and really leverage on this conversation? Because we don't have choice anymore, right? So as you say, like a lot of people go to want to participate now, is now the glorious age of conversation.
Well, let me just talk about that in 2 dimensions. One is that I think in every retirement home, there should be good internet connections, because for people who've got families, a lot of families now are global families. My family and your family are not living locally, most of them, and yet we can have conversations with our family whenever we want. And amazingly enough, it's free. Well, most of the time it's free. There are free options. You can pay for premium services. The other area that I found interesting since COVID, I got involved with an organization called Lunch Club, and that links me up once a week, because I choose once a week. You could choose every day, with somebody around the world that you can have a conversation with. So I'm told on the connections I get, I've had 225 conversations with people that I would never have met or had conversation before.
Wow.
Now, the vast majority of them, I've only had one conversation. There's always been an option to have more. I don't know what the figures are of people who have had subsequent conversations, but quite a few people end up by having further conversation. Some of them even end up by doing business, but they're random. Only once have I had a problem with that conversation, and that was with somebody who just didn't seem to be interested in asking questions or having a dynamic interaction. In my view, I won't go into the difficulties that I think existed in that particular case, because I think it was a special situation. It's also interesting that I think about, at the moment, 3/4 of them seem to come out of the United States.
Yeah.
These days, we usually spend quite a bit of time talking about how people are using AI. And so we end up by having instant, common, professional language that we can have a conversation about.
Are those people that they select supposedly randomly? Do you feel that there's not an algorithm that keeps sending you people that you're going to agree with most of the time, instead of people you are not going to agree with?
The whole selection process is supposed to be random, but based upon how you define your interests. Now, a lot of them have investing interest. Some of them have parenting interest. I don't put that down, but I get people who have got a family, and some of them have photographing interest. We rarely talk about that. Most of them, I would say 95% of them are younger than I am, but there doesn't seem to be any particular difficulty in having an interesting conversation. I think the system that was set up, I believe LinkedIn is now probably going to go down that route too. But Lunch Club did that 5 years ago, although the people who developed it seem to have gone on to other things. and allowed almost the computer systems to run the system itself. People on it get referred by other people on it. So there is a sort of self-selection. I can't remember who suggested I should go on it in the first place, but I found it interesting.
Yeah. So if we zoom out now, let's rebuild the society now from scratch.
Wow.
So if you could rebuild the society today in this AI age, what is the first principle you will build that on? Don't tell me about conversation, though. What else?
Well, empathy and humanity.
Why empathy and humanity? Because we'll think that this is what humans are, right? So, but how come that this is going to be like the first thing to build on?
Well, I think there's far too much conflict and unnecessary disagreement. I've seen it in all sorts of ways, and I think that a lot of people these days get incredibly depressed. And there was a figure that was in the paper at the weekend that said there's a massive increase in the number of people who don't watch the news or read newspapers except for sport now, because they can't cope with all the conflict that's going on. It's a sort of negative pollution. Personally, I think Trump is responsible for more intellectual pollution than anything that I've come across in the last 50 years. And it causes people to get very frustrated and depressed. So you have to deal with the negative sides, trying to how do you reduce the negative sides as well as build on the positive? Now, if you're wanting to go back to this very interesting issue about how do you have meaning and purpose in your life, there are 2 or 3 simple ways, relatively simple ways of doing that. One is, of course, a lot of people get it through religion, but you still have to deal with the negative sides of some of those religious patterns. If only all the people who believed in the importance of religion recognized that love thy neighbor was the central tenet of almost all the 12 important religions that we have in the world, would solve a lot of problems. So that's one thing. Another thing is helping other people, which a lot of people get an awful lot of meaning and purpose out of that. And a lot of people in retirement can get into charitable activities, working with local organizations, helping other people. Another area is being in the moment. And there's a massive meditational movement that helps people be in the moment. Now, that can apply to people who spend their life climbing mountains. It's not something I've ever done, but I can understand how they find it very powerful from being in the moment. I'm not quite sure how mountaineers adjust to not having that powerful meaning moment in their lives anymore. Some of them write books about it. Some of them can get into coaching other people. That also applies when we talk about retirement. We talk about retirement age of 65. What about the sports industry? The sports industry is a massive industry, growing enormously. People have to retire at 20 sometimes. People have to retire at 30, 40. We don't spend enough time recognizing that there are massive changes that have taken place in society that require us to look at these dimensions with a different lens. And if we can look at it from these different lenses, we can transfer the learning into other areas.
You always talk about curious people and curiosity and not having enough focus to focus on one thing. What would you tell your younger self, the curious younger self, about purpose and how today the new generation was coming here? What can they learn from your experience, knowing what you know now?
Looking back on my career, I can't say that because of the way it's worked out, can't really pinpoint to areas that I would complain about. Because if I took a situation in the past where I would make a change, it would have a ripple effect and I wouldn't be here today in this way. One of the areas which is very problematic and for us all is that I think that there's been massive change in what's acceptable in the nature of intergender relationships, and that has changed radically. So I would probably go back and say to my younger self, be a bit more careful about the intergender relationships. And I think the most profound, I wrote about this in the 80s, I think, saying that the most profound cultural change in the 21st century was going to be the result of the changing role of women. And I think both professionally and personally, that is happening. It's going to happen in a much more significant way. And it's difficult to know how it's going to work out, because I think it is a very critical factor that is not widely recognized or discussed in the declining birth rate in those countries where the changing role of women has been particularly profound. Although two of the countries where that has happened most significantly is South Korea and Japan. They're not countries where on the surface you would say, although we've now got a Japanese prime minister, that the changing role of women has been particularly significant on the surface. But I think underneath it, we could spend a whole session discussing this, but I think underneath it, the changing role of expectations in the next generation of women is very different to the expectations that, say, that group would have had 50 years ago. Very different.
You also share some of the experiments you made about female political leaders. What were your conclusions briefly about that experiment?
Well, that was a result of an article that was in the New York Times that seemed to think that female political leaders tended to be right-wing. And having just read the books written by the ex-Prime Minister of Finland and New Zealand, I thought I would see a more extensive analysis of female leaders, political leaders, using AI. And AI identified the fact that there were more left-of-centre leaders than right-of-centre.
Women leaders.
Women leaders. Now, you have to make some allowance for the fact that some of these leaders have had to be successful in a male-dominated environment, so they've ended up by reflecting the male agendas, perhaps, at least on the surface.
Yeah.
But the key question is whether underneath it there is a more caring, empathetic agenda, more responsibility-driven agenda moving through the world or parts of the world that is going to increasingly squeeze the power-driven, ego-driven male agendas that have generally been responsible for all the conflicts that we've been having.
Yeah. Before we close, I'd like you to say the key message that you want listeners to take away from our conversation today. So those who are listening to us and those watching on YouTube, what's that key takeaway?
Key message, I think, is to try to enjoy exploring these issues. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and try to engage with AI. Help your curiosity and help your learning, because there's no doubt that the human race faces enormous challenges in being able to work together. It's got a lot of real problems, and it shouldn't be spending so much time trying to solve problems that we've solved or problems that are not helpful in creating a better world for everybody.
Wonderful. So where can our listeners learn more about you and your work?
Well, I think the simple answer is on LinkedIn. I haven't got involved in having an active website personally. LinkedIn is quite a good way of engaging with people from all over the world in most of the time constructive and positive conversations. And I put up the exercises that I have done on there, and I'm working on updating them because the new technology enables us to do so much more easily.
Yeah.
But I suppose to keep learning and keep trying to enjoy life.
Yeah. Thank you so much again, Bruce, for sharing your insight today on the Meaningful Work, Meaningful Life podcast.
As we wrap up today's episode, I want to pause for a moment and breathe. Bruce reminded us that the future won't be shaped by faster machines, smarter algorithms, or endless streams of information. It will be shaped by the questions we dare to ask, the values we choose to protect, and the humanity we refuse to outsource. He showed us that curiosity doesn't fade with age. It expands when we remove the noise, the titles, and the pressure to perform. He also reminded us that meaning isn't something we find once and lock in. It is something we practice moment after moment for as long as we are alive. And perhaps most importantly, he highlighted something essential for the AI age. The real scarcity is not knowledge, it is focus, it is discernment, it is wisdom, and it is meaningful human connection. So here is your purpose sprint for the week. Check one area where you consume information but avoid reflection. What is one role, label, or identity you might be overly attached to? What is one conversation you've been avoiding because it requires patience? Replace 1 hour of passive consumption with something slower, writing, walking, or deep questioning with a human or even with an AI. But ask better questions, not more questions. Because as Bruce reminded us, when we explore, we discover. And when we discover, we create solutions that didn't exist before. This is how we live, lead, and thrive on purpose in the AI age. And if you want support in reconnecting with your own strength and purpose, you'll find a free Ikigai quiz at francinebeleyi.com/podcast. The show notes of the episodes are also available on the page francinebeleyi.com/podcast. And finally, we need to zoom out because the future of AI and the future of purpose will not be decided by one culture, one geography, or one worldview. The next guest will shed some light on this. I'll see you next week for another episode of season 11 of Meaningful Work, Meaningful Life podcast. Until then, dream, act, and make an impact. Lots of love.